The other very interesting question about these 19 characters, whoever they were, is how were the alleged terrorists physically capable of carrying out the alleged actions? And that means, how do you take over an aircraft with plastic knives, box cutters, or anything of the sort? Therefore, we have questions like, were these planes replaced by drones? The distinguished German researcher Gerhard Wisniewski has advanced the hypothesis that they were replaced by drone aircraft. Others have argued that they were controlled, remote controlled by the Global Hawk technology and ran into the buildings that way. The question, of course, is a supermarket caliber terrorist is not going to be able to perform a tour de force of aeronautical skill. These are people that would have had a hard time getting a driver's license in most states. And this is Wisniewski's 9/11 book, one of the best sellers in Germany, and of course he's put a television program on German primetime news. Another question, were the alleged phone messages from the passengers and the crew authentic? Somehow a lot depends on whether Barbara Olson really said the things she was alleged to have said. These messages have never really been officially published. Various parts of them have been made public, and they're highly suspect. As, for example, Andreas von Bülow argued in his book on the CIA and the 11th of September, it's within the repertory of a serious intelligence agency to be able to have imitators who can sound like somebody. Under conditions of stress, they can convince acquaintances, even friends of somebody, if maybe the connection is bad or something like this. They can essentially mimic the voice of somebody. And a lot of these phone calls are to people that are not within the immediate circle or family of the people involved. Why were no arrests ever made for insider trading? How can it be possible that the SEC and all these other agencies cannot track down people who made these colossal bets on airline stocks? Why was there no air defense? What was the reason for the stand down? Why were there no interceptors? The long-established standard operating procedures of the Federal Aeronautics Administration, the North American Air Defense Command, were all simply flaunted. And it's a case of incompetence that is relatively circumscribed. Before and after, these things tended not to happen, but on this day, essentially, all the rules were simply suspended. And there'd be a lot to say about each one of them. Obviously, each one of the 14 points hides hundreds of individual questions. Then there's the problem that, by and large, historically, modern fireproof skyscrapers do not collapse as a result of fire. The Meriden Plaza Hotel in Philadelphia in the early 1990s burned until it was a gutted shell, but it did not collapse. So was the World Trade Center a case of controlled demolition? Were charges incorporated into the static structure of the building? Gerhard Wisniewski shows photographs that this is the case, that this is what was done. One of the problems, of course, is that in the case of the second plane hitting the South Tower, the majority of the kerosene was burned in this huge cloud that you see, and therefore was not available to stoke the fire on the inside of the building. Ironically, this building collapsed before the North Tower. And then even more puzzling, what happened to Building 7 of this complex, a 40-story skyscraper in most cities, which collapsed in the afternoon? And there's a very suspicious exchange of comments between the owner of the complex and various authorities, which raises the question again of controlled demolition. This happened at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. What explains Bush's behavior on September 11th? The long reading lesson, the flying around in Air Force One at low levels, going to Louisiana, going to Nebraska. The 11th point, why was the Islamic world blamed on the basis of absolutely no evidence pointing to the Islamic world? Bin Laden and al-Qaeda are, of course, long-standing CIA assets. The way that this was done seems to have more to do with Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations thesis, with the Richard Pearl clean break, with the William Crystal Project for a New American Century, and so forth. And perhaps, too, we have the Guantanamo concentration camp. We have the possibility of being declared an enemy combatant any day, any time of day. What explains the shift to preemptive aggression? Is it, as Mike and Ruppert and others have argued, declining world oil production? Is it an attempt to preserve the U.S. dollar as the world reserve currency? Is it the fact that we're in a very severe world economic depression? Is it all of these? In other words, the motivation for the group of people that are now running the show. And I think the most important question, who are the real September criminals? Generally speaking, people have accepted the idea that Bush and the administration lied wildly on Iraq.
There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
I don't think it's too much to ask people to consider that they may have lied on these other matters. Again, the identification of bin Laden, naturally, he seems to have taken credit, but this has absolutely no standing. Any police agency in the world has to have tests to see if somebody who confesses to a crime actually has enough inside knowledge of the crime to have been able to carry it out. Otherwise, you get a mythomaniac. And, of course, the inevitable exploitation of this for psychological warfare purposes. What explains the drive for a totalitarian state? There clearly is one. The question is, what is the point? Haven't the moneyed elites of this country done pretty well under the current system? What is it that forces them to go further? Machine, I submit, is a CIA, Brown Brothers Harriman, Skull and Bones, Bush family, neocon, oligarch faction.
And the surest way to avoid attacks on our own people is to engage the enemy where he lives and plans. We are fighting that enemy in Iraq and Afghanistan today so that we do not meet him again on our own streets, in our own cities.